Ambassador Jan Matthysen joined the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 1984. He started his Foreign Service career as First Secretary at the Belgian Embassy in Bonn, followed by an assignment as counselor at the embassy in then East Berlin, where he witnessed the reunification of Germany in 1990, and he was there when the Berlin Wall came down. From 1994 to 1997, he served in Belgrade, first as chargé d'affaires and later as ambassador. Following his time in the former Yugoslavia, he became head of the NATO desk at the Foreign Ministry in Brussels. From 1999 to 2000, he served as the acting head of the General Directorate for Political Military Affairs. At the same time, he was senior advisor on Kosovo to the United Nations, Secretary General's Special Representative for the Balkans. In 2000, he was appointed ambassador in Ankara, accredited to Turkey, Azerbaijan, and Turkmenistan. In 2004, he moved to Southeast Asia, serving as the Belgian ambassador in Bangkok and accredited to Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, and Burma, Myanmar. He began his current appointment as ambassador to the United States in February 2009 and presented his credentials to President Barack H. Obama on May 20th, 2009. Ambassador Matthysen graduated from the University of Ghent in 1973 in contemporary political history. We would also like to welcome his wife, Mrs. Agnes Aerts Matthysen, and they have 5 children. Ambassador, it's a pleasure to welcome you. Welcome to Brigham Young University.
Thank you for such a wonderful reception, and I must say I was impressed by all what I witnessed this morning. So I'm here really to learn from you and from this wonderful institution we are visiting here today. We have only 50 minutes, not even that, and I want to be as close to what you expect as possible. So I think for me, even the perfect option would be to reverse and to start with question time and then to make the lecture, but maybe you don't have at first any question. Anybody wants to start off with one? Not really? Well, I think as an introduction, I will try to say a few essential things about the relationship between Belgium and the United States and also about Europe and the United States and the transatlantic reality. First of all, I think we all should be aware how big that relationship is in economic terms. It's sometimes forgotten. Our politicians, our political attention goes to the emerging markets, because there we think the growth will come from. But did you know that in a country like Belgium, 11 million people, sophisticated economy, very central in Western Europe, there is more American investment in Belgium than there is American investment in India and China combined. Amazing, is it? And then it's not something from the past. Last year, 2010, was a record year in American investment in Belgium and the other way around. We are creating as many jobs on this side of the Atlantic by Belgian investment in the United States as American investment is creating jobs the other way around. These are staggering numbers. If you see that in volume and in financial effects and in job creation. And even if we can maintain at a slow but steady growth that enormous bulk of economic reality over the Atlantic, it's much more important than whatever progress quickly we can make with these new adventurous markets. So this is a key message we have to repeat, that is, this transatlantic economic relationship is essential. It is the bulk of, it's our lifeline, in fact, on both sides of the Atlantic. Another dimension we never should forget is that about 85% of the world population lives in societies where there is no real freedom of speech, no rule of law, and no democratic institutions able to produce a change of government if the population wants another government. That's what we call democracy. It has different forms, but 85% of the world population does not live under those circumstances, not in a free economy and a democratic society. The 15% living under those conditions are living mostly in the transatlantic area. 15% is a minority, isn't it? So how the world will evolve will probably be a matter of these 85% versus these 15, and let's hope that the others take as much as possible away from our ideas to evolve in that direction, but it is not absolutely a given thing. And the third thing I think of importance is the reality of the European integration, Europe. On this side of the Atlantic, sometimes we, all European ambassadors, we are confronted with skepticism. To say, well, it cannot work. Even economists with big names, in fact, they are writing it's not possible to run a currency with different economic policies underneath. Or they say, look, between the north and the south of Europe, there is so much difference that you can not produce a credible, unique currency. But on the other hand, the markets are reacting differently. The euro stands now at $1.4. So it's not that unsuccessful. The euro did his thing. And it's now, there is no other currency. I saw the number, it's about 800 billion euro in notes and coins. In fact, there is no other currency being so big in that mass as the euro. So it's strange that a concept that in theory could not work is in reality quite successful. And the euro is maybe the biggest symbol of what Europe as an experiment was able to produce, but underneath that there is a lot going on. Belgium had the European presidency last semester. Now it is the Hungarian. For the first time, Hungary has the presidency. For Belgium, it was our 11th presidency. And this is because we are among the founding fathers. Now, such a presidency is a good occasion for a country to reflect on its role in Europe and to reflect on what Europe can do and cannot do. And we did a lot. For example, under our presidency, our ministers were fighting and really doing the impossible to have a speedy decision-making process on financial regulations. Now, these are easy words, but if you see how the battle is going on in Congress, and that is only in one country, you can imagine what it means, in fact, to bring that in line on the European level. But the Europeans were able, last semester, to do what they had to do in matters of financial regulations speedily, efficiently. And that's what our presidency had to do. That means, in reality, that your Belgian finance minister is presiding over a council of 27 plus the commission, finance ministers, and they have to produce a result, which is, first of all, a diplomatic task of preparation, because you have to prepare all these points of view. You have to produce texts and you have to negotiate ahead of your actual meeting. And then you have to bring that to a conclusion politically acceptable to all your participants, because in most cases, Europe is still deciding on a consensual basis. So these are the most difficult procedures to follow, but we do. Another example is when sanctions on Iran had to be decided. So of extreme importance, because in fact once the decisions come out, just like with Libya now on the level of the Security Council, you have a possibility to act or to decide on the principle, but you have to translate that into legislation or action. For Libya, this means you have to send planes to bomb. For Iran sanctions, it means you have to make regulations and legislations implementing what you in theory want to achieve. And this means limiting bank activities and so on, and that over 27 countries, and we did. And we did it even almost faster than Congress could do it. So Europe, and especially under our presidency, we were able to produce results and be swift and decisive where it mattered. Maybe in your questions we can come back on Europe and on Libya. I would love to do that. But I want to develop one other point, and that is the importance of the emotional depth of the relationship, which makes that relationship so unique. I do that with the example of Belgium, but it goes also for other European countries, to show that with America we have much more than just an economic relationship or a handy diplomatic extra dimension. It is fundamental between our populations. From Belgium history, Belgium was independent, was made independent in 1830. And already 2 years after our independence, we opened an office in Washington. That was not an embassy then, because we thought that this new structure on the other side of the Atlantic, it was not a kingdom, and in these years Europe was organized between monarchies, so we had an office there for trade, because trade was an issue. We thought that there might be a potential, and we continued not having really a full embassy. We call that une légation, a legation, which is a lower level of representation. And guess, in 1914, at the beginning of the First World War, which embassy for Belgium was the #1? Now, I'm the #1 ambassador for Belgium because Washington is considered to be the biggest ambassadorial posts any Belgian bilateral diplomat can have. But in 1914, no idea? You all think it's Paris. It was not Paris. London? No. It was St. Petersburg. Because to be an ambassador at the court of the Tsar was the most prestigious, biggest, and they thought the most stable, because they thought that Paris was unstable, revolutions and so on. And the second was Vienna, the empire. If you keep that in mind, you see how far we come in our history. Washington was not an embassy, and St. Petersburg was one. How was the situation a bit later? I jumped to 1920. In 1920, our king came here, King Albert. He was the hero of the First World War, and he became a king and queen close to President Wilson. And they came to visit him, but he was very ill. I think he had a stroke, wasn't it? And it was a moving scene. It's in the history of President Wilson that, in fact, the Belgian king was asked to come up to his room where he was lying in his bed, sick, not able to. And there you see a Belgian king coming to Washington. Why? Because the First World War was a total turmoil. The Americans came in, not just with military force, and that we have to remember. In the First World War, Belgium was brutally attacked by our beloved neighbors, now beloved, then enemies. with a lot of civilians killed, with all the farm equipment, all the horses, everything taken. And then our king held out in one part of the land, in a long line, along with then over France and so the trenches and Flanders fields, you know, the battlefields of Europe. What happened to our civilian population? Well, they were starving. There was a blockade overseas. Holland was neutral. There was a barbed wire electrical fence, very modern in these years. And the Germans were taking all the food out of Germany for their war effort. Who saved us? Herbert Hoover did. There was an American young businessman who made the Belgian Relief Fund. And he was, in fact, organizing, America was neutral until 17, organizing shipments of rice and wheat to Belgium. And these rice bags with the name of the Hoover Relief Fund on it are still a very familiar object, in fact, shown to us in many families because they were physically saved by it. And it created a particular bond. But when then, in 17, the American troops came in the war, they made a decisive difference in the war effort, and so the liberation of Europe was possible because of that last-minute American intervention. This results also in the Flanders Fields war graves of American soldiers on Belgian territory. But it is in the Second World War when these things came to a much more dramatic dimension even, because the biggest battle fought, land battle fought by the Americans in their history is on Belgian soil, the Battle of the Bulge. This was a fierce battle, full winter, where the German troops tried to regain control of the port of Antwerp and were cutting through the lines of mostly American units. And 70,000 men were lost, 20,000 killed, 60,000, 50,000 wounded, and a battle as bad as a battle can be. And so it's our honor, my wife and I, to every year to receive the veterans in our house. It's 66 years ago. And you can imagine how old they are now. When they were 22, 23, then they are now in their late 80s. But last year we had 72 of them in our house. And we tried to bring in a military band, and we give them a Christmas buffet and do something. And that is important because what I try to explain with that is that between countries there can be something as an emotional bond. And this is important because sometimes you have to argue also against each other, but then it's more of a fight in the family than really something more serious. There is that undercurrent. And I give you another example of that bond, and that is American immigration from Europe. So Americans leaving Europe to find their new life in the United States. 2.6 million of them went through the port of Antwerp. There was a shipping line, the Red Star Line. It's a famous shipping line. And they shipped between 1880 and about 1925, 2.6 million immigrants. So the last thing they saw from the old Europe was in fact the port of Antwerp. So what we are doing now is the buildings of that shipping line are still there. And there is a lot of documentation and there are a lot of objects and so on. So we'll make next year a museum of that. In fact, it's the counterpart of Ellis Island. So there is a lot to share between our countries, but we did also a lot together. After the Second World War, NATO was created. And the negotiations were done in Washington, and our ambassador was among the 5 ambassadors negotiating actively to get that treaty done. Why did we do it? Yeah, we had to do that because after the Second World War, 5 countries joined immediately together and they tried to organize something like a European defense. And the Treaty of Brussels was made, but that means that the Benelux countries plus France and Britain said we have to do something to prevent what happened again. Because the generation of my grandparents, they thought that war was an inevitable fact of life. They lived it twice in their lifetime. Between the two world wars, there's only 20 years. My grandmother had it as a teenager, First World War, and as a mother with a big family in the Second World War. Had twice a war on their territory. So they thought we have to organize ourselves in a different way than it was before. And therefore, alliances were made, and the first was the Brussels Treaty. But the problem with that was that with such a Brussels Treaty, you cannot engage the Germans. Because the Germans were big, they could become dangerous, but we did not allow them to start again with a military infrastructure and army. So that's why we were looking to the other side of the Atlantic, and it was also an American interest to prevent that happening again. And then NATO was created. I will not repeat all the elements to that, but history is then evolved and in such a way that the headquarters of NATO are now in Brussels. It gave to Brussels a particular dimension, only NATO, but we have also the European Union headquarters there. For NATO, that meant that the whole effort of the Cold War, and you are too young to know what it was to live in the Cold War, but for Belgium, it meant that about 350 miles away from Belgium, and 350 miles is nothing, the Russian army was standing there with tanks and missiles and whatever they had. And that very probably, and I think we know now, that one of the first atomic bombs to be launched by the Russians, you can imagine what the target might have been. If they have to choose one city in Europe, it might have been ours. I mention this because there was a considerable effort invested by our populations, and there was a considerable psychological tension out of that Cold War area, and this resulted after the Cold War in a demilitarization almost of Europe, where in fact we withdrew our troops from Germany. Maybe you don't know that, but the Belgian army was deployed in Germany. It was not in Belgium, because we had to hold our sector in the collective defense against the Iron Curtain. So our soldiers, they were in Germany. They were not in our own country. So we have to reorganize all this. And the main political attitude of the population was, okay, the Cold War is over, we reduce our armies. America did the opposite in these years, because America had a much more international security drive. We did that, but in the same time, next to our security, we developed the European Union. And with the European Union, we are among the strongest believers of it. We think that the ultimate future of the European Union is to become more and more unified. It will not be a straightforward process. There will be longer periods of time where the process is halted. And I think now, for example, we are in one, because we made a major step forward with the Lisbon Treaty, with the unique representation of external representation of the European Union through Mrs. Ashton, and to have now a permanent president of the European Council, it's our compatriot Herman van Rompuy. But as we see in Libya, for example, it's not the European Union taking the lead, it's individual countries like France and Britain taking the forefront. So with that, I think I'll leave it to that, because I think it's better to go for your questions now. You might pick up some of what I've said or things I didn't say now. Can I go for questions?
Sure. Please just wait for the microphone, because we are recording, and then tell us your name and what you're studying. And have some time to ask your questions, please.
Hi, my name is Carson Marsh. I'm studying mathematics and accounting. And I was wondering, you mentioned the need for the European Union to become more and more unified. Do you think that the language barriers between countries is going to be a hindrance to that goal?
It's quite a circus in Brussels, you know. Legally, all the languages of the European Union are recognized on an equal basis, in a sense that you require, and in the European Parliament and in the work of all the bodies of the European Union, you can ask for your texts in your language. And this goes through a cascade of interpreters. First, there is an immediate interpretation to a few main languages, and then it's split out over all the others. It works, but it's not very convenient. But what we see in recent years is that English is seeping through as a common vehicle, whereby even at the highest level, I will not say who it is or individually name top politicians, but if you bring people like Mr. Sarkozy and Berlusconi and Merkel, and if you bring them together around one table, you have to make it work. And we see an increasing tendency, even at that top level, of people who are politicians with a totally different background and are not supposed to have the same language skills as people who knew from the beginning that they would go for an international career. They happen to be politicians, and then, but they are doing a lot in English right away. So I don't expect the language problem to be the problem. Certainly not. But what you will always have in Europe is an extreme delicate attention for regional cultural diversity. That is something, it has a positive side as well. But it sometimes it sometimes creates problems. You can drive through Europe, and the name of the city is in different languages throughout your travels, and it's sometimes very complicated. But it works. Next question.
My name is Dennis Meyer. I'm a master's student in French. I think it's fair to say that in many ways Belgium is sort of the center of Europe. It's certainly a meeting place. Within your own country you have several languages and cultures, and you manage to make that work, and you manage to make it work well enough that many other countries come to Belgium to talk and discuss with each other. I don't know if it's something that you could reduce to any simple trait, but do you think that there's anything distinctive in the Belgian national identity which lends itself to cooperation, that lends itself to working with other cultures?
Thank you for this positive assessment, because we Belgians, we are fighting all the time, but we don't kill each other. Nobody ever got killed in the Belgian language quarrels. We have these quarrels for generations. It's part of our life, so we have to reorganize permanently our country. And it sounds sometimes very dramatic. It's like in a bad marriage where the other party said, well, if you don't agree, I divorce. And that's what you have. If you have a federal system with two, you have to agree with the other party. You cannot make a compromise over 5 or 6, just with the other side. So the Belgian language struggles sometimes are harsh. I don't think we have a recipe. Why? I was in Turkey and as ambassador, and in Cyprus you have the Turkish-speaking and the Greek Cyprus part, and they are killing each other. That is a very violent situation. was ambassador in Belgrade. And you have the Bosnian situation, where you have 3 entities. And in both cases, specialists went to Belgium and they asked then the Belgian ambassador, could you provide maybe experts and advice? And so we always were very cautious to do that. Of course, they can get institutional advice on how you make the checks and balances if you have to organize a difficult country with several entities, to respect each other's autonomy and to do your best to but first, you need, therefore, a level of non-violent political activity. And it's not a given, it's not always the case in the conflicts of the world. The second point is you can only do that if you are rich enough to pay for a compromise. It's very important. Where there is poverty, you cannot make a compromise. The third line is you can only make peace in such a, or hold the peace internally in a country with such an internal struggle if your neighbors are benign to you. If your neighbor is part of the problem, then you cannot make your internal peace. And that is the case in Turkey with Cyprus, where the Greeks are linked to and the Turks. So you cannot apply the Belgian recipe to something. You couldn't do that in Bosnia because there you have other interested parties outside. So therefore, for your question, thank you for for your positive comments, but it's not as such something we can export. It can be an inspiration that not all problems have to be solved immediately. You can live with problems sometimes for a very long time. It's sometimes better not to cut the Gordian knot than and to leave it for a while.
Hi, my name is Stacy Slight. I'm an international relations major. And my question for you is about the integration barriers to the European Union. Because of the growing Arab Muslim minority in the European Union, I think it's safe to say that that's one of the biggest barriers to integration or to European unity. And so in Belgium, what are some of the ways that you have been helping facilitate their integration into the community? And do you think that that's an issue that would most effectively be addressed by individual countries or by the European Union as a whole?
Thank you. This is a question with many layers. I think the easier part of it is on the immigration, and the Islamic immigration in itself is not that much a problem for European integration. If it has an effect, then maybe towards more Europe, because it's one of the problems crossing over all borders. We have that in common, so we all have an interest to have a common approach to the common problem. There is one dimension where it might play out, and that is for the future with Turkey. The question when Turkey can become a member of the European Union is sometimes brought in a context of the difficulty to integrate Islamic immigration into our societies. Because many of the immigrants in Western Europe are of Turkish origin, or there is an idea in our population that it is a problematic dimension of our future, so that the population might go against integration of a country like Turkey because of the sentiment against immigration as they have it now. So in this sense, there is a link. And it's a difficult thing to handle because populism takes over once you start talking in a superficial way about immigration. And there are problems with that, you cannot deny that. And there is radicalism among the Islamic communities. But this phenomenon is not just a European one. There is also a huge debate in the United States about that, how we deal with that. What the countries are doing, the integration of immigrants in general, of course, it's a bit different than the United States because Europe is not an immigrant country by its nature or vocation. It is a reality because of our land borders. You can take a bus and come from Pakistan all the way over to Europe. There is no ocean in between. And even the Mediterranean, if things really go wrong in Libya and Tunisia and so on, the Mediterranean is very close. The distance between Tripoli and Naples is less than, is it true, between New York and Washington? These distances are extremely close. And so it's a reality our societies have to deal with. And it is a society where the land is taken, densely populated, but with a high sophisticated social welfare system, where in fact newcomers, and that is their first step in integration, are taken care of by the systems. Health, children, education, even housing and so on. The social system provides a lot. So this is a very difficult, politically very difficult thing to handle, especially in times of budget restrictions, where in fact the government has to size down the whole social system. And then, of course, populations said, why, look, these immigrants, they are coming here, they're living on our, so on. And there is also the debate about an aging population, where in fact the immigrants are the younger population, so demographic balances are shifting within the cities. There is the religious dimension, that they come with another religion and they stick together, so that cities are changing in character and so on. There is no immediate response to that, and the policy of the governments is in fact to deal with all the aspects of it as good as possible and locally. There is I see no major principle, general rule to say stop all immigration, because it would be impossible to do so. There is, you could not imagine a measure to be taken, in fact, to stop it. And it's certainly one of the concerns pushing Europeans to do now, to take more action in the Libyan crisis. It's certainly one of the considerations is in fact the fear for an extra push in immigration.
Hi, my name is Adam Jacobs. I'm studying political science. And I spent about 9 months in Antwerp in 2009. And I noticed the linguistic cleavages between the two halves of the country. But do you feel like the economic prosperity in the north is pushing that cleavage a little further between the Flemish and Wallonians?
That's certainly a factor. The south and the north in Belgium, they have different economic dynamics. Unemployment in the north is in the range of 6. In the south is 14%. And then immediately you have a debate about, of course, allowances and so on are paid in the north for the south. There is a different attitude in, if you live in a political context with a different economic environment, that population asks for a different policy as well. So that is certainly a problem. Now what we see recently is that the south is picking up. So they could attract the fair share of new investment in new sectors, pharmaceuticals, for example. So there is some bright light at the end of the tunnel. I could not say at the end of the horizon, because the horizon is endless.
My name is Emma, and I'm a sophomore studying social sciences. And on the topic of integration, once again, we had a lecturer come in a few weeks ago, and he spoke on his idea that he thinks that it would be beneficial for Europe to become a whole country, like the United States of Europe. Would you think that would be beneficial? He was like saying that they would have a central like Congress or a kind of parliament kind of thing, and I was wondering what your thoughts were on that.
Our former prime minister would love it because he wrote a book, The United States of Europe. United States of Europe, and for a real European federalist, as we call it, that is the dream, to say, okay, we go for that. It might take us another 30 years, 50 years or so, but that is the goal. Now, it's not so easy for several reasons. You don't start from a blank situation. You start with lots of existing realities, interests, habits, languages, traditions. So it's not that easily done. But what we do is, in fact, create a structure realizing already parts of that united Europe in several layers. And what you mentioned with one Congress, that is the European Parliament. And the European Parliament, we shouldn't underestimate that. In the new treaty, the Lisbon Treaty, the role of the European Parliament has increased. And Congress here saw that. It's a technical matter, but we run into a problem with the data transfer and controls in a matter called SWIFT. These are controls over banking data over the Atlantic, and also with problems about passengers' identity for planes. And suddenly the European Parliament said, no, we won't do that. They blocked legislation which was important for America. And what happened was that the American Congress understood that just that it's important to lobby at the American Congress if you want things to be done. They had to lobby to the European Parliament if you, from American point of view, if you want things to be done. So there is a parliament, and there is a structure. And now with Herman Van Rompuy and being the permanent president of the European Council, that also is something like a president of Europe. It is certainly not in dimensions like the American president, but it's a start. There is a man preparing every month the most crucial meeting of the European Union, which is the meeting of the 27 heads of state and government, the Merkels and Berlusconis and Sarkozy and all of them. All these prime ministers come together in one council meeting. And how can you make them produce a result? This is by carefully preparing that meeting and do it in a way that they come to a conclusion in one afternoon and evening session, as they do. And it's working. And the person who is doing that, preparing that, had to be some of them. And it was the former Belgian Prime Minister who is now the permanent president. His job is, in fact, to produce every month that presidential session and to make it a success. So that comes already close to a one top executive body, one parliament. So we are working on that.
At the beginning of your lecture, I'm Courtney Potts, and I'm studying sociology here. But at the beginning of your lecture, you mentioned a statistic about how America has invested so much in Belgium that it's larger than China and India combined. And that was really surprising to me because I haven't heard of anything. And so I was wondering if you could provide an example of where American investments and Belgium investments are being reciprocated in an economic system.
A few. Yeah, of course, the most spectacular one is now that InBev owns Anheuser-Busch Budweiser now. So this is that's quite spectacular. But for example, Food Lion, your the supermarkets, they are Belgian. Yeah, that. This is 75,000 American jobs because of that. These are things, they go quietly all over the United States. Some Belgian companies have their flag as a national flag. Some others don't. They are just international companies, just like, do you know Unilever, for example, or Shell, or Dutch, but same way InBev is Belgium. But these are financial groups largely owned by Belgian families, with Belgian tradition, Belgian know-how, in fact, but expanding over the world and doing also their business out there. For American investment in Belgium, Ford, for example, they have a very big automotive plant there. They are very present, but also other companies like Monsanto, Caterpillar, most of them. Because an American company working globally and on the European market, most of them, they want to be present with at least a logistic office and a lobbyist around Brussels. It's important for them to be close to the center of the decision making, in fact, there. Plus, it is a test market in a sense that once an American company wants to introduce its production in Europe, in fact, one of the best places to start doing that is around Brussels somewhere. Because there you have an immediate access, you can, the public has a bit representative taste. What works in Belgium will also work in France, but also in Germany. So it's a good access point, and therefore Belgian American companies are quite actively present out there. But also in Holland, because Holland attracts even more investment than Belgium. And but you can consider these Benelux countries as one economic reality, of course, with different governments, different nationality. That's all fine. But the reasons why American companies are investing are similar, because you choose for location. In fact, that's it. But there are, I think I have a list of about 150 Belgian companies being present in the United States in all different sectors. Okay.
One more question.
My name is Addison Jenkins. I'm studying civil engineering. And you touched a little bit on this earlier, talking about cultural differences and applying that to other parts of Europe in the Balkans. And my question is, one of the major problems it seems like facing the world these days is integration of different societies, especially in Africa, where you have different tribes, and in Eastern Asia with North and South Korea. Europe has a very unique history of recovering from a devastating war barely 60 years ago, and now you have them all sitting at the same table. What was the secret to Europe's success, or what kind of lessons can we learn from Europe becoming a unified entity barely half a century after such a devastating war?
It still amazes me how it was possible for my parents and grandparents to come to peace, to make peace with the Germans. When my wife and I, when we went to Germany for our first post, we were born after the Second World War, and we were not that much affected by that sentiment. But my wife's father, he fought in the trenches of the First World War, and you have to imagine the trauma of a young man being away from home. His parents, the parents died in the meantime. When he was at the front, he couldn't come home because, of course, Germany occupied the land. And the trauma for these people was enormous. He thought that his health was affected by poisonous gas, because you had these gas attacks then, that he postponed his marriage for about 20 years. That's why my wife was born late enough to be young enough to be my wife, you know. But when then he had his young family, he overcame the traumas of the First World War. He had the Second World War over his head, and they burned the house where the family was hiding in the basement. They were in the battlefield, again. And a few years later, our politicians said, well, we make peace. We shake hands with Konrad Adenauer and the Germans, they can arm themselves again. And then before we knew it, we accepted them as members of a new union. And so we are doing well with our and that is the secret of Europe. That is that reconciliation, that it was possible. Why it was possible? Maybe to a certain extent exhaustion, that all the remedies of the past, all the devils of the past were seen in the most gruesome dimensions, that you say, oh, never again. We cannot continue with that nationalism opposing one country to the other. Let's hope also for the better, that with more education, more sophistication, bit more that you have another society able to make these compromises over these narrow borders of these countries. But these days, nobody's questioning it. Nobody's questioning the need to have more European integration, and everybody enjoys driving over the European highways. You don't slow down. When you come at the border between Holland and Belgium, you don't slow down. You just go over it, and then you come at the German border and you continue. And you don't have to change your currency like it was before. You have your euros and you go. So it is one country. It is just like going from Maryland to Virginia. The same thing. And so in that sense, the states of Europe are looking like the states of the United States. And there will be no war possible anymore between states of Europe. Just like the United States. You had one as well. Thank you.